So, like, I want to have an Louise.
I shared your copy.
Dang it. But I wanted the whole notion of adjusting these things on the fly because they are living documents to our thinking, which over the course of this entire week of overload of knowledge has adjusted this presentation immensely. But I'm not throwing everything out. So I'm here to talk to you about what I call culturally responsible game design. And I want to begin with this idea that this has been a fan-frigging-tastic conference. Woo! Feel free to woo. And I want to say, of course, thanks to all of the organizers and volunteers who have put this work in here together to get us together at an international level of conversation. And it is the work here, this talk, these designs here, the workshops, everything is part of the work, but it's not the work. Once you get out of this conference, the work begins. So I ask you, how can we run games and characters with deeper, reciprocal, responsible, and respectful forms of thinking? In order to get to understand what's getting me here, I'll introduce you to myself in a much deeper way than just the bio will introduce, because as we've had a very great variety of feminist theorists and feminist designers come in here, standpoint theory becomes a part of how I want to frame who and what I am within this work. Again, my name is Gabriel de Los Angeles. I'm 37 years old, male, cisgendered, an indigenous scholar. I'm also son of Chief Andy de Los Angeles of the Snoqualmie Nation, my father who led the work that re-recognized the Snoqualmie Nation within the United States federal system of recognized tribes. I am co-founder of NDN Players Research Group, a group of three other scholars, including myself, that is intergenerational, intertribal, and interdisciplinary, and focuses on the problems of representation in contemporary and popular culture of indigenous peoples. I'm a fourth-year doctorate in learning sciences and human development. So I study play, specifically. Some people keep referring to me over back home as a LARP researcher because, I just keep talking about LARP repeatedly. But this is the layer of interaction of play that I want to categorize, and I just choose to use LARP as the method and focus of my designs. I've been a game player since 12. I've done AD&D and Dragonlance and Greyhawk all the way back when I was a wee lad, and we were all sitting there talking about THACO. Because I was growing up in Washington, I was there for the alpha and betas of Magic the Gathering. I sold my cards way too early. Played on Atari and Intellivision, MUDs, and I had a love for bulletin board systems and the wonderful sounds that modems make when you're connecting to something. And I tell you this to situate this in my story and why the work I do is the work that I do. And to add to that cribbing of thoughts that have evolved over time, over this weekend, I want to call out this idea that who and what I'm choosing to represent within my thinking also has shifted, because I feel like I didn't want to forefront that I've also been the convention chairman for an anime convention up in the Pacific Northwest called Sakuracon that has also been involved in various levels of fandom and have studied fandom informally and sometimes formally, because we silo out our geekdoms, and I feel like at a certain point that I self-censor and self-shame myself over what kinds of geekdoms are proper to interact with other kinds of geekdoms. Thus the other sets of conversations about from tabletop to LARP. And it is, yes, to call it that wonderful phrasing that was actually referential to several indigenous stories and other cultural stories, it is nerds all the way down. So I'm calling to you about something that doesn't exist, culturally responsible game design. And my keynote my 3 points are going to be going over the idea of how does your game educate, because I am an educator and study how people learn. How do you educate? And I'm going to change what I'm saying here quite a little bit. And then I'm going to make a call in honor of my genealogy, not just in the people that have brought and forefronted the work that I do and who I am, but even my friends in my circles. In a conversation with my friend Avery Ellicott, they had this wonderful question to me of how can you get to more progressive forms of thinking if you're always seated in forms of historical violence? So, implicit and explicit education. So, games are driven by people. We've talked about this over and over again in various ways and spaces, and I'm going to take a seat amongst the instruments of progressive thinking around here. Progression of my thinking, because some of this is scripted and some of this isn't. Games are driven by people, not characters or plots, not good or evil or grayness. Every choice is a human and relational one, and to say otherwise is to give agency to someone outside of yourself, and removes your own sense of power over life and identity. Our LARP communities, as we've talked about in various other conversations, are made of people and the characters that they are part of, and exaggerations of ourselves, in fact. So we, the players, the community, are not simply distillable to traits, even practices on an individual level. We're built up. We're built up from our personal histories, our choices, our communities, our families who brought emotions and experiences into our lives. We express them in our characters in various ways, both explicitly and implicitly, with design, with intent, and without it. And the stories that come from these games that we play, they teach. The rules teach. The way we physically represent something teaches. And so then I want to say to you that words matter. Words matter, from the smallest unit of communication to the narrative themes of your games and characters. You are building foundations within not only your characters, but in yourself. And when you're building games, the language you use, the names, the tropes, the settings, are built on these histories of a shared humanity. Raise your hand if you've ever researched things for your character. Well, for a game design and setting. Okay. For rules and mechanics. Where are you getting your information from? Be specific. What cultural places are you pulling your designs from? Be specific. What influences make up where your garb is based? Why did you choose a particular weapon? Be specific. Because I like it. Becomes very general. Why do you like it? Because I want to represent X in the game. What about X is important to be represented in your game? Where did the thought come from? Be specific. If you can't identify why you're doing something, it may not be a great design. It may not flow with other parts of what you've already made important. And it may hurt someone who wasn't prepared for something in your game because you weren't specific about these things in your setting, rules, policies, or your characters. And not to call upon these things to take away from our level of fun. Somebody said something, one of the other presentations, about the idea of doing this for fun. Why do we do this for fun? Why do we do this because we wanted to have fun? And I want to call out against the things that I've already written. Being able to do things for fun is okay, and it is a choice to make, and it has an effect on who can and who will opt in and opt out of your game. Choosing to make a fun LARP or a fun character for you might mean you define what is not fun for a culture in a culturally responsible way. So saying that something was fun is great. Tell us what isn't fun to you. When you're specific about things, we can talk about how we are educating people, not just what we are educating them with. In education, curriculum and content is not the only thing that matters. Your pedagogy, or the way that you teach things, also matters deeply. So games, being an informal form of teaching, is not just like another form of storytelling. So this means that how you teach these things matter. Most games that don't delve deeply into the wildly avant-garde or abstract spaces, whatever you choose to name them, utilize conflict and struggle as the things that move stories and their characters forward. And I'm going to focus on that specifically. We've heard various peoples in our communities talk about the idea of realism or authenticity. Because we want our LARPs to sometimes be a microcosm of the realities in our human lives. And let me say there's nothing inherently wrong with using conflicts and struggles represented in our lives, especially if you're going to be specific about what you're doing and why you're doing it. In fact, theoretically, it's all what we can do and the only thing that we can do, and that's another keynote. However, there is something iffy about using them blindly or without thinking about them. And what I invite you to do, all to join me in doing in the idea of realism and the deep execution of realism is to illustrate it. And I wanted to originally pick apart two places where I was thinking about it. But really, to go back to, again, in the meta, these things are changing and progressing, and I really want to call that out. So, as an entire weekend gelled into waking up and scribbling notes on a little pad of paper early in the morning. Again, call out the idea that our standpoints are an identity, our identity as a set of frameworks. And these frameworks lead to a shorthand of understanding, of complexity, of deep, complex cultural spaces, as Eric talked about, the iceberg of culture. And it creates a set of labels. I've heard, and the researcher brain does not turn off, so as I listen to everybody else talk, the idea of trying to create a set of universal languages creates labels to get to an identity as a framework. And all of this about, of course, again, reducing the complexity of cultural ways of being, knowing, and doing, and yourselves. And this, again, creates a boundary, a limitation of the human mind and the human identity and the human experience. But then, to have to put that kind of information out is you're weighing this up against the limitations of time. And that's okay too, because your investment in your time is also as important as your investment in your identity. And so for me, again, in this process of how do you educate, I wanted to demystify a sense of scholarship that goes on here, because in various ways, there's been subtle performances of anti-intellectualism or anti-academic spaces. And that's sort of a gatekeeping of practitioners of knowledge in one direction and the other. Brody, not here, okay. A fantastic undergraduate researcher who is producing great work on psychological analysis of intersection is doing the work of undergraduate research, which is subtly not acknowledged at the levels of academic performance that a lot of us here have been invited to do, including myself as a student. I am a student, a doctoral student, not yet a candidate. What's that mean in the context of the research and thinking that we all do? And so, in carrying you along with the dynamism and evolution of thinking, not in the perfection of it. I'm thinking, I wrote this down, cribbing this real fast. Throwing out of, what was I saying? This whole notion of perfectionism, throwing out the imperfect set of knowledge, not acknowledging a set of mistakes as process or progression of evolution of your thinking and ways of being and knowing and doing. You yourself are gatekeeping your own sets of designs, your own characters, your own things, that thing that you thought of was a really fantastic idea that you're not getting to produce because you were waiting for the perfect time for you to produce it. You're only engaging your own destruction of those ideas and ourselves. Really, how do you educate? Because you are all academics. You are all thinkers. You are all reflection specialists, practitioners, theorists, historians, ethnographers, and these labels create a set of formations of reduction of practices, knowledge production. And really, I'm encouraging you to be specific, because I also want everyone to be active listeners, that you sit there and take in the complexity of what everybody is saying and doing and how they're saying and doing it. Yes, and again, these are all investments of time, so how you choose to weigh out your time and practice is an entirely different and specific thing to argue about. I'm a big fan of popular culture, having gotten to present and attend the Popular Culture Association with Sarah. And I love Kevin Smith, particular producer, writer, director, and in his space of talking about podcasts and living, he calls upon the idea of, and I'm going to paraphrase this, food intimacy and to be heard as part of the importance of the human experience. So instead of calling out this idea of what I originally wrote of critical versus plain offensive examples, it's an incorrect and reduced set of thinking myself, but critical versus referential. We're making references to our own lives in these games and of ourselves and these designs and all these spaces. We just choose to make references to our culture or whatever. And we want to do it from either a referential space, to just pop it in there, aka Family Guy, just it exists, and we put it in there because we want to make reference to it. I'm a geek. Of course I talk in layers of references all the time. I could spend a half an hour talking only in references to scripts, music, and lyrics and pictures and comic books. In fact, I have. But I'm also calling upon us to be talking about these things in a critical way, in a reflective way. So not just adding something in just for having the sake of it be a part of your design. Reflect on these things. Reflection to perpetuate, to adapt, to create, to unlearn, to change, to unmake, to remove, or even to leave. Because reference is just performance of identity without deeply thinking about it. And as we've talked about in the fallacies of safety, there is convenience and dangers in reduction of the human experience. Again, this idea of the fallacy of lists, or the conversational piece that we have when we come into interactions with non-LARPers. You have to experience it for yourself. If we don't create a set of spaces about being specific so that others who want to actively listen to what we're saying, then the communication doesn't happen, right? There's no set of understanding. We can't give somebody a sense of support. We gatekeep how they can come into our space, whether or not they want to opt in or opt out. And for my academic space, this removes the idea of building agency as an important construct. And of course, again, your time's important, and this exhaustion of your time can mean stopping trying to do this at the same time, for any amount of time, but for not quitting, because the practice of how we want to interact with with each other, is important. I feel like I start to get to ramble about this, but because I'm very, I would describe myself sometimes as anxiety-ridden, but I'm really anxious about this. I'm excited. I am floored by the knowledge of production that has happened so far, and so trying to incorporate an entire weekend of things that have changed and shaped how I want to do the research and what I'm researching is exciting to me, so I feel really nervous about this and sweaty. And so again, I'm thinking out loud. And there's good and bad to talking about this, and references. I've been watching a show with my partner called Rick and Morty. You may have heard of it. And so there was one particular quote within the show that rambles through my head once in a while. Yeah, if you spend all day shuffling words around, you can make anything sound bad, Morty. And I'm not here to make these things sound bad, but I am here to call out their complexity, to call upon the reduction not as a bad place, but also to call out the complexity as a place that should be acknowledged and worked through as well. We look for reduction to start a conversation, and the reduction of experiences should be the beginning of that conversation, not the totality of it. So we're looking for transparency, specificity, not abstraction. And again, thanks Jason for telling me to write this down. The wait for perfection is the death of progression, of evolution, of doing, of making, of writing. I even wrote down the death of being alive. So again, how can you get to more progressive forms of thinking if you're always seated in historical forms of violence? It doesn't mean avoiding historically perpetuated forms of violence. We want to play in the experiences that we know. But there's a difference between just reskinning it or putting a new direction, a new skin on top of it, new spin on it. I love South Park. It makes reference, but then goes into deeper layers of how those things interact complexly with the things that are against it as much as they are for it. And seated in violence in various forms of way that we all even play in almost regularly. And those senses of violence can be about hard and soft power, about lateral and hierarchical violence. You can explore contemporary forms of violence and power in much more deeper ways than simply making reference to that exists. And the thing about this is that the work, again, this is about progression and evolution of design, iteration, and we wait for those iterations to be perfect. And it doesn't matter because we need to become the space of being okay with being wrong or making the wrong move, in fact, so that when we get to a incorrectness in our design, which I have heard over and over again from game players and game designers, I made a mistake running that thing. Oh, I forgot to bring this out. Oh, it's going to change their experiences. Oh, it's going to do this and that. It's okay. Those experiences occurred as they were meant to, and if you choose to change them the next time, that's okay too, because it's a progression and an evolution. Again, how can we run games and characters with deeper forms of thinking? Reciprocal, respectful, and responsible forms of thinking. Be specific, listen actively, both to criticisms, to yourself, to your players, to your designers, to people who don't even LARP, and be okay with making those mistakes and making those wrong moves, because in a sense of cultural responsibility to yourself and to your community, those are iterative spaces, those are cyclical spaces, those are feedback loops, those are whatever abstract comment you want to tie into it, because what matters is that active form of listening. And again, I want to remind you that this is the work. Yes, it is the beginning of that work. After this, when you leave this room, begin that work in your community. Everything that happens after you leave this conference is really the work. And with my contact information there, these are really complex spaces. These are very difficult spaces to have to engage in. They're hard issues to tackle because it isn't written, because we're performing the development and evolution of culture within our own games and spaces, and because we are here and excited and anxious at the same time to be on this stage with people whose names I've read deeply, whose work I idealize, whose work in community and practitioner space develops all sorts of national and local games in ways that I barely conceived of. We're all peers of play, and we're not here to tackle each of our game designs alone. Do not tackle them alone. Reach out. My contact information is here for you to contact me, but then you also have your community to talk to as well. You can find me on Facebook too.